Sunday, July the 11th, 1982, Southampton. Britain's unlikeliest warrior edges towards a berth in history. Rust-streaked, undamaged, proud. Canberra, the great white whale, comes home from war in the Falklands. Never was there a day like this. And never will there be another ship like this, nor a story like hers to be told. This is a liner that was turned into a cruise ship which went to war. This is a ship which once cheated the breakers and which a nation then took to its heart. This is Canberra, the ship that introduced a generation to holidays at sea.
Time is 12 o'clock noon.
For thousands, this is the way that Canberra will be remembered.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is the officer of the watch. Since our departure from Piraeus until noon today, Canberra has steamed a total distance of 392 nautical miles.
Since her departure from her builders, Canberra has steamed more than 3 million miles. But they were not all like this. Canberra was never built as a cruise ship. The requirement in the mid-1950s, P&O decided, was for an ocean liner. It would be bigger and faster than any of the company's existing ships. Its role? To develop the profitable passenger service to Australia and open new routes to the Far East and Pacific. The £16 million contract went to Harland and Wolff in Belfast, then the biggest shipyard in the world. From the word go, job number 1621 was to break new ground in ship design. Bill Harrison was a member of the design team.
There's the lifeboats, for instance, which normally were on the upper deck. For the first time, I think, ever on a ship, they built them in underneath on the promenade deck. That was new, and it's, in fact, has set a pattern for passenger ships to this day.
Well, she was built for the comfort of the passengers. The design was radically changed. The engines were put aft, allowing far more space in the ship for the use of passengers. Public rooms also were better situated.
Mike Bradford was one of Canberra's midwives. He was attached to the yard for the build, the start of an extraordinary 28-year association with the ship, which culminated in his becoming her captain.
But going back to the forward part of the ship, you had inboard cabins which all could view the sea from a small window. This was completely new in design, and of course we were allowed to build a far bigger ship by the fact that everything above the promenade deck was made in aluminium.
Now, for us as builders, there was a fair bit of new ground being broken because we had no experience, indeed no shipbuilder at that time had experience of aluminium welding, so there was a learning in that. It was very successful.
The decision to power the ship by steam-generated electricity came as a surprise to some, even in the late 50s. Bill Harrison.
It was a heavy machinery plant. It was an expensive for operation and much more expensive, as it turned out, when it went into service because of the fuel costs.
But quite the most radical design feature was to place the engines in the stern. It had only been done once before. The theory was sound.
The best part of the ship, the widest, the squarest, the most spacious, is midships, obviously. So why put the engines in the best part of the ship? Why not use that for the passengers, particularly for things like restaurants and large public rooms? So that basically was the main reason. There is an added advantage too, that with the machinery aft, you're taking the noise and the vibration further away from the passengers, rather than have the engines going underneath them.
But Canberra's engines were too far aft, making her stern heavy. To help compensate, it was planned she would carry 1,000 tons of cargo. The idea was quickly scuppered.
Captain Wilde, the first captain of the ship, came to Belfast just before the handover. He said, oh, we shan't be carrying 1,000 tons of cargo. So right away we had a major problem in our hands. As a temporary measure, because of the absence of cargo, for the first voyage or two, we put pig iron ballast in the cargo hold, and that helped to reduce the trim. As more permanent, in the end, we converted the cargo hold spaces to bunkers and tankage, so that with the additional oil forward and on occasions water ballast, then we were able to cope with the trim on the ship.
The pig iron was removed after the first couple of voyages. One consequence, though, of this uneven weight distribution was to remain with the ship for the rest of her life.
The design draft was 32 foot 6, but because of the machinery aft and other things in the design, it was designed with a 4 foot trim by the stern, which means in fact that the after draft would be of the order of 34 foot 6.
Canberra only had one problem, that was a very deep draft, so we were limited to various parts of the world where we could go safely. A little difficult turning, but once you got to know the ship, fine. Of course, in a heavy sea where you couldn't get a better ship.
Canberra had other important qualities. In the first place, she was fast.
The purpose of the speed was to allow us to run out to Australia in probably the best time known to date and around the Pacific, and the whole voyage would be completed in just over 3 months. I think our trial speed was about 29.23, which was quite a speed, and the service speed that was required was 26.5, 27. Bearing in mind that passenger ships hadn't done this for a great number of years, apart from the Atlantic, it was quite a move ahead for P&O.
Bill Harrison voices one other impression of Canberra, one that was to grow down the years.
To me, as a naval architect, and obviously I'm biased, she looked like a ship. And frankly, I think that is one reason why Canberra has lasted so long in the popularity of the public, that people know they're getting onto a ship to go on a cruise. If you want to go to a hotel for a holiday, go to a hotel. Canberra hotel standard is as good as anything afloat today, but it has the advantage of being a ship. And it looks like a ship. I mean, some of the modern, not all, but some of the modern passenger ships look like office blocks on wheels.
For Harland and Wolff, Britain's biggest passenger ship since the Second World War represented good news and bad. The bad.
That it lost money. Not a lot, but a significant amount in those days. And really, it was the beginning of loss-making shipbuilding. We had competition building up from the Far East. I mean, not just for Harland and Wolff, of course, for the British shipbuilding industry in general. It was probably, in the post-war area, which is all I know, the best ship that Harland and Wolff built. Now, we've built bigger ones, we've built perhaps in some ways more difficult ones, but Canberra, to me, was the epitome of British shipbuilding.
45,000 tons of ocean-going liner ready to take the water at Harland and Wolff's Belfast yard. The largest shipyard in the world, it has a long tradition of building ships for the P&O line. So, just 9 years after Prime Minister Menzies had named the Canberra bomber, his wife, Dame Patty, gives the same name to a liner.
I named this ship Canberra. May God protect her and all who sail in her.
A pause while the launching gear takes over. Australian wine to wish her well, and the latest P&O liner moves majestically down the ways.
From the day of her launch in March 1960, Canberra has always been special to Belfast.
So far as Belfast was concerned, the day Canberra was launched, it was almost a national event. Now, albeit it's a very small nation, 1.5 million people, but it was a big thing. And even today, there's a new concert hall, suite being built in Belfast, and one of the rooms is the Canberra Suite. Now, that's, 35 years or so since the ship was built? I think that's the answer. It's very much a Belfast ship.
Canberra opened a bright new chapter in shipbuilding as she stood off Gourock. The 45,000-ton liner, commanded by Captain Geoffrey Wild, made a round-the-coast cruise to show the luxury ship to the thousands of holidaymakers between there and Dover. John West, 33, assistant manager of the P&O, designed Canberra. Some of the amenities will come into their own in the tropics. Meanwhile, a few brave spirits tried them out.
It quickly became obvious that Canberra possessed something that caught the public's imagination and affection, even on the shakedown cruise.
And that was a terrific experience. We went right round the coast from the Firth of Clyde down to Southampton, and very, very close in, much closer than it would be on a normal voyage. And right round the coast of the British Isles, Scotland, England, Wales, and particularly the south coast, the cliffs, the shore, lined with people. We went into Tor Bay, and if I remember, it was Whit Sunday. And the number of small boats that came round Canberra and Tor Bay was something I'd never experienced before nor since. And that shakedown cruise to me was a great experience.
On the maiden voyage, Captain Wild was in command. Mike Bradford, one of the senior officers. The 3-month itinerary took them to Australia, New Zealand and San Francisco. Of the 2,238 passengers who set out, 870 were emigrants. Over the years, thousands of emigrants would begin their new lives aboard Canberra, travelling on £10 assisted passages. P&O saw the maiden voyage as an important flag-waving opportunity.
It's estimated that we had 50,000 visitors in the various ports we went to. My main recollections would be entering such ports as Sydney or Vancouver or Auckland and seeing what amounted to hundreds, thousands of people just waiting to see this magnificent ship arrive.
Making her stately way up harbour, Canberra was watched by thousands of Sydney people. She too was a curiosity, a ship with a new look which can cut the passage to Australia to 3 weeks. Canberra's magnificence, by the way, was well matched by the modernity of Sydney's overseas terminal where she berthed. She's the biggest liner built in Britain since World War II.
One of the passengers on the maiden voyage was Alice Lovely.
They threw streamers. We had streamers. Oh, it was wonderful at Sydney. The people, there were hundreds and hundreds of people there.
Now 94, Mrs. Lovely particularly remembers their reception in Australia.
Oh, wonderful. Oh, wonderful, because she's well lit up. She looked beautiful. She really did. And there was crowds that came down, and always do. Even today, you'll find crowds of people always come and see us off.
I can remember seeing all the lovely ladies in Australia all dressed up to meet the ship with their hat and gloves, and it was quite the social event of the day when a ship like Canberra arrived.
These were the first of Canberra's heydays. She was doing the job for which she was designed, carrying passengers around the world in relaxed luxury, her only competition from rival liners. In those days, she was a 2-class ship. The first-class section was amidships. The Meridian Lounge, Crow's Nest Bar and Bonito Club were all first-class preserves. They were twin-set and tweedy days, when it seemed the only time you took off your tie was to go swimming. Despite the divisions, the 2 classes managed to fraternize, as Alice Lovely remembers.
The first-class passengers used to come through a separate door. It was divided off completely. And I didn't realise what it was for, but one of the gentlemen said to me, "That's first class, but we prefer to come through."
Canberra's life as a liner continued more or less without interruption, although in 1962 she was temporarily crippled by a fire in her engine room. No one was hurt and the ship was able to hobble safely into Malta. The most significant part of that incident was the fact that nearly 2,000 passengers completed their journeys to Australia by air. It was to be almost another 10 years before the full implications were recognised. In the meantime, the seductive quick step of sea travel seemed set to go on forever. Lord's Cricket Ground, headquarters of English cricket, has also played a role in the Canberra story. the MCC teams travelled to Australia on Canberra. Sir Colin Cowdrey had a hand in Canberra's design. He was invited to collect the cricketing memorabilia that decorates the Cricketers' Tavern. Caps, stumps and pads are displayed on walls, which themselves are lined with willow, the wood from which bats are made. As a player, Cowdrey made the voyage to Australia 3 times.
Well, it was a dream come true. It really was. The excitement of travel anyway, and there were long trips. When I talk to my sons about it, for instance, and they say, "Hey, you weren't really on the ship for 23 days, were you, Dad?" And I said, "Well, we were actually." And they said, "What'd you do?" You know? There was a daily routine. We would meet at something like 10. I think between 10 and 11, we'd meet in a special sitting room, signing autograph sheets. I think we all had to sign about 15 or 20,000 of these before we got there. It was quite a marathon. And after that one, we moved into a little slight training thing, not too hard by today's standards. But we had a little trot on the boat deck and a few exercises. And then, unfortunately, on this trip, much to the players' disappointment, Gordon Perry was aboard, the great British athlete, and Ted Dexter, who was a tremendous perfectionist, suddenly thought, this has been sent to us, we must use Gordon Perry. He started to train us rather harder, which didn't go down too well with our bowlers, who just not only bowled the whole last summer, but the winter before. They'd come to put their feet up, and they didn't like the Gordon Perry tactics at all.
Bringing the MCC touring team to Fremantle, the liner Canberra. Ted Dexter and his players all set for a cricketing summer, while Britain settles down to winter. At a press conference, the Duke of Norfolk told Australia, "We intend to play the cricket you want us to play." That implies following the attractive play policy.
Not on board, obviously, you ate a bit too much, you may have drunk a bit too much. For those continuous socialising, most lunchtimes there'd be a group who'd love to see some of the players, and then you'd have in the evening there'd be a cabin saying, "Please come and join us before dinner," and a very good dinner. So obviously we weren't going to live like that the whole of the tour, but it was very nice. It was a very nice holiday rest. I mean, those trips were a part of my life. I shall never forget them. To live in such style, beautifully looked after, to have time, I think, time to read and time to talk.
But now there was a distinct cloud on the horizon. In January 1970, the first jumbo jet crossed the Atlantic. From that moment, the writing was on the wall for the long-haul ocean liner. 6 jumbos could fly as many people to Australia in a day as Canberra carried in a voyage of 3 weeks. Mike Bradford.
Gone were the passenger liners, the big jets had come in, and we reverted to cruising. And considering that the ship was never built for cruising, the carriage of freight to Australia and the Pacific, and so we changed over to cruising, and I think we adapted extremely well, probably better than a lot of other ships would have done.
Into New York Harbour for the first time sailed the P&O liner Canberra, impressing knowledgeable folk on the famous waterfront as the latest Queen of the Seas.
Canberra was converted to a 1-class cruise ship, but in 1973, with a slump in the UK market, she was sent to America to operate out of New York. It was almost the end of her. Richard Esdale was then in P&O's marketing department.
We were very short of passengers. I and some colleagues were recruited to go over there in the January of that year to try and rescue the marketing situation because we were sadly lacking in numbers. There were some operational problems because Canberra had never faced the freezing weather which is experienced in New York, particularly in the harbour, in January and February. So there were some problems with her plumbing and so on. But the main situation was that we had insufficient time to make an impact on the American market, to find the passengers in time for the early cruises. And indeed, for the whole of her very short season there, we were never anywhere near capacity, no matter how hard we tried.
Canberra was taken out of service, while in London it was debated whether she should be scrapped.
We on the UK marketing scene were trying desperately to prepare a very convincing case for her retention, because we were quite sure that the market would pick up again, which in fact it did, and we were very relieved that our case was finally accepted, but it was very much a touch-and-go situation. And I'm not sure, in fact, with the withdrawal of the ship, whether the company would have ever been sufficiently convinced at a senior management level to invest in cruise ships, which eventually, of course, they did. it would have been a very, very sad decision.
With her reprieve won, Canberra entered another halcyon period as a cruise ship pitched squarely at the British market. Top-class entertainment in the old Palace of Varieties tradition became an important ingredient. Tom O'Connor, one of the stars who has appeared regularly on Canberra, still rates her his favourite ship. But isn't she a bit old-fashioned?
She's old-fashioned and she hasn't got a lot going for her. I mean, the Stadium Theatre, which I love the Stadium, it's really not the best theatre in the world. I mean, the ceiling is low, the air conditioning is wanting. I always do the gag about, sorry about the air conditioning, somebody shot the bat. And it's really not got a lot going for it, so it's got to be atmosphere alone. Working conditions for an entertainer are quite amazing on the ship, and particularly on the Big White Whale, because there are dressing rooms, but I mean, you wouldn't dress in there, unless you were doing a big show and you had to change quickly. The secret of working on Canberra was to change in your cabin and then find a sneaky way up to the backstage without anybody seeing you. And I used to have ways of doing that. Because there are rooms and passageways and what have you. It's like the priest holes of the old days. There are backstage routes on Canberra that the passengers would never find. Canberra's a special ship to work on because it's as if you're talking to a family all the time. I mean, I don't just work on stage. I go around the decks and I talk to the passengers and what have you, and the crew. And it's as if there's a mode of life aboard that everyone has to follow. You instinctively find this kind of theme, and you've got to be part of the ship. It's an institution. There's a folklore about the ship, and it's so easy to work.
On April the 2nd, 1982, Argentina invaded the Falkland Islands. Canberra was in Naples, nearing the end of her round-the-world cruise. Her master, Dennis Scott Masson, heard the news on the radio. He thought little more about it. The following morning, he received a signal to say his ship might be requisitioned.
I was instructed most firmly not to allow anybody on board to get a whisper of this news.
So I was summoned down to Plymouth, met a planning party of 5 other officers from various sections of Her Majesty's forces. We then flew out to Gibraltar in a rather cloak and dagger operation and boarded the ship as it came through the Straits of Gibraltar.
And up came this captain and several, which we later realised were SAS men. They had everything but the dagger in their teeth. And I remember a little old lady saying, "I think it's disgraceful that first-class passengers have to board the ship up a rope ladder."
When it was finally announced that the ship was to be requisitioned, which was shortly before we arrived back in Southampton, I did something which was, more or less unique in a merchant ship.
He mustered as many of the ship's company as could be spared. He explained the situation and gave them until the following day to decide what they would do if their ship was called up.
Of the 800 and something crew we had on board, of which roughly a half were Asians who were not involved in this, although they would have willingly come down. The other 400 British on board volunteered to a man. There was one exception, a young officer who was a genuine conscientious objector, but he was the only one who said he wouldn't come, and this included all the girls, the Steiner staff in the hairdressing, the shop girls, the entertainment girls, people we didn't imagine we actually would need to look after a lot of bootnecks.
With 1,600 holidaymakers aboard at the end of their cruise, Canberra returned to her home port.
In the early hours of this morning, the Canberra sailed into Southampton to be converted from luxury liner into troop carrier. Even before the 1,600 passengers had disembarked, the Ministry of Defence had taken over and preparations were starting to accommodate the 2,000 troops and all the necessary equipment. A shipbuilding and repair firm moved in lorry loads of steel girders with which to construct a flight deck capable of handling at least 3 helicopters. And officers of the Parachute Regiment and the Royal Marines started making arrangements for the 2,000 men who will be reporting there tomorrow. Also aboard will be 250 of Canberra's crew and 30 Royal Navy nurses.
Now the ship had 2 captains. Dennis Scott Masson, the P&O master, had overall responsibility for Canberra's safety. Captain Christopher Byrne, the senior naval officer, had tactical command.
You're probably right.
They were reunited at the Fleet Air Arm Museum in Yeovilton, in the Falklands section. Canberra had now to be accoutred for battle. Captain Byrne.
First requirement was to provide the facilities for helicopters to land and take off on the ship. And before the ship had got back from its Mediterranean cruise, Vosper's in Southampton had been given the order and the drawings and had proceeded with the pre-manufacture of what was to be the midships flight deck for helicopters. And the main building function that took place whilst we were in port for those 3 or 4 days was the insertion of this flight deck over the swimming pool.
In the 60 hours she's been in port, Canberra has been fitted out with equipment to enable her to take on fuel and stores at sea. But the major work has been to the 2 helicopter decks. This one, forward of the funnels, is already completed, and its special strengthening over the swimming pool is now ready to take the Sea King helicopters, which will be ferrying men to and from the ships and other activity when the Canberra gets to the South Atlantic. But this second helicopter landing pad just forward of the bridge is still a long way from being completed. Parts of the pad itself and the strengthening which will go below decks are still being loaded, and as a result several dockyard mateys are sailing with the ship.
Jeremy Hands of ITN reported the war both from Canberra and the Falklands. It was he, incidentally, who memorably nicknamed the ship the Great White Whale.
We thought we'd probably be back within a week or so at the outside, as far as maybe Tenerife, we thought, then once around the Canaries and home again, while Mrs. Thatcher and Al Haig and the various others who were involved in the diplomatic process sorted it out. Little believing for a second that it was actually going to be over 3 months before we civilians, thrown into this band of soldiers, would actually get back home again.
In 3 days, Canberra underwent a lightning conversion from luxury cruise ship to floating barracks.
Well, funnily enough, the actual conversion was relatively small. None of the carpets or the paneling or any of that was removed. Most of the pictures on the bulkheads were left in place. The Steiner's saloon still had the hair dryers sitting there for the ladies' hair, and they just sort of worked around all these objects. And as we progressed further south in due course, things got changed more and more, but initially there was very little physical change.
By April the 9th, the ship was ready to sail. 2,500 troops, mainly paratroopers and Royal Marine Commandos, were now on board.
On the quayside, the ones who were being left behind were putting a brave face on it, while those who were going couldn't conceal their excitement. One dockside worker said it was just like the Second World War, the last time troops embarked at Southampton. The bands of the Royal Marines and the Parachute Regiment played their regimental marches. At 8 o'clock, the last mooring rope was cast off and Canberra was ready to sail. The liner's crew, civilians who volunteered to sail with her, threw down streamers while the families of those who'll fight, if fighting becomes necessary, waved a patriotic farewell.
I think there was an air of unreality about it. In fact, the military personnel, quite rightly, took it fairly seriously. The 14 pressmen who we had at that time on board just didn't believe it possible that it would come to actual fighting. They thought the age of that sort of thing had passed.
Mike Bradford was deputy captain.
I think most of us on board looked upon Falklands as another P&O cruise.
But it was actually quite hilarious because we were going to war in a 5-star floating hotel. Everybody else was stuck in horrible little floating grey things and bouncing up and down in rotten seas and heavy weather. And we were sipping gin and tonics and enjoying real cruise lifestyle, going to war, which was quite strange and weird, and it somehow didn't really feel like going to war at all.
We still had a number of ladies on board. I forget how many we had in the ship's company. It was mentioned at one stage that we would take the ladies out, but they kicked up such a fuss that it was decided by the senior naval captain that he would leave them on board. And I think a very wise move because they played a very great part, I think, in the operation down in the Falklands.
There are 13 civilian women aboard, working as telephonists, nurses, stewardesses and secretaries. And in the shop, where sweets and suntan lotion are going like hot cakes, is Sue Wood. Her husband aboard is a barman. But how does she feel about the new passengers?
Well, yeah, it's very hard work, but it's good. It's, you know, everyone's so pleasant anyway. They're a real pleasure to serve, they really are.
It was impossible to believe that we were going to war. The mood on that trip down to Ascension Island was very much like a cruise. We were looked after, as P&O always did, in incredibly fine fashion. They treated us like passengers, not clients or soldiers. We were looked after extremely well. The mood was one of obviously some sort of expectation, a little bit of excitement, but never any real belief that it would come to real fighting. And it was a bit of a party atmosphere, to be honest. On the bridge, it's P&O navigating officers who are in charge, albeit acting under naval direction and working alongside naval personnel. The relationship between the crew and the troops is good. For the soldiers, the civilians bring an air of normality in what for many of them is an unreal situation. For the P&O crew, it's a cruise with a difference. After all, it's not very often a passenger comes in for a bar of chocolate with a rifle under his arm.
I don't know how you would perhaps describe the ship at that time, except that we were a very fully worked up military unit. There were something in the order of, I don't remember the exact figures now, but 2,000 troops on board. We had machine guns bristling everywhere, and we were virtually a warship. We had every facility on board as well, and we had hospital facilities, but we were a fully worked up and trained combat ship.
As we got closer, every mile we got nearer, then things became that little bit more serious. A little bit more effort was put into training. We had to go through exactly the same training routines and physical fitness campaigns as the soldiers themselves. We were going to go ashore with them, and they said, you can only come with us if you prove yourselves to be fighting fit. So we had to get involved in all their PT and so forth, and we wanted to. We didn't want to be the usual sort of journalist drunks and smokers that we really were. I mean, we had to be as fit as they were, and we did. But that didn't start until later. That really was when we began to think, goodness, we really might be going to war here.
There was a fine esprit de corps, and morale was extremely high. The Naval Discipline Act, which we came under when we left Ascension Island, was never used against the Merchant Navy crew. So that's a great proof of the discipline that existed and the code of conduct which existed amongst their Merchant Navy and the P&O crew.
As it's likely that Canberra will be spending long periods at sea, it was essential to prove that she could be replenished by the fleet auxiliaries which are accompanying her.
Refueling at sea was not a normal manoeuvre for a cruise ship. Even more foreign was to effect a blackout on a vessel which was designed to be lit up like seaside illuminations.
Biggest problem we had actually were the senior officers, senior military officers I should add, who were often called from dinner to go to their cabins to put their blackout in order. And I think probably one of the worst jobs in the ship were the junior officers, military officers, who were designated to ensure the blackout was effective.
The task force sailed south. On April the 20th, Canberra arrived off Ascension Island, where the final preparations were to be made. It was while she was there that her size proved an unexpected advantage.
Assistant Chief Wireless Officer came to me one day and said that he'd been up on top of the bridge and he'd noticed that there was a merchant ship that had been on the horizon for several days. And this, of course, was visible from Canberra and her bridge, which was much higher than any other ship. Antelope was sent immediately to investigate, and it turned out to be an Argentinian merchant ship, which was sitting on the horizon, watching the operations that were going on at Ascension. She was chased off.
Now the mood changed.
By the time we got to Ascension, for various reasons, it became apparent that we probably would have to go through with the operation.
The ship at Ascension, there was a moment when we actually realised that we were probably going all the way. And that moment was when my cameraman, Bob Hammond, saw another warship flashing across to Canberra, and he's a shortwave radio expert and knows all about Morse code. And I said, what have they flashed? And he said A69. And Canberra had suddenly been given a naval number.
The thing that really, I think, brought people to reality, certainly brought the press to reality, was the fact of Sheffield being sunk and Belgrano being sunk. That really made people wake up with a start.
Then it got colder and windier and rougher. And there was the extra edge to the weather, there was the extra edge in the way people were talking to each other. We suddenly realised that we were going to go and end up on the Falklands, and it wasn't going to be very pleasant. And very soon after leaving Ascension, then we realised that that's exactly what was going to happen. It suddenly stopped being a cruise. It suddenly became a campaign.
3,000 people were now going to war in a 45,000-ton ship, 10 stories high, painted white and with yellow funnels, which in her cruising days had been varnished to give them an extra shine.
We felt extremely vulnerable because we were by and far the very largest unit.
Whilst we were at sea and abroad, the white colour was actually an advantage, because due to the very misty conditions one gets down there, it was probably about the best camouflage colour one could have, and one melded into the background. And there were many times when we could see the grey painted warships long before they ever saw us.
We were told that yes, the ship is part of the task force, yes, you are well protected, nothing can go wrong. And we wanted to believe that, and we did believe it. But deep down there was this sort of rather strange feeling about, do I really want to go down to E-deck if we do get hit by a rogue missile or a torpedo or whatever? And of course the heart starts pounding and the mind starts playing silly games. So we tended to spend more time either on deck or as high up in the ship as we possibly could. And we weren't alone in that. Some of these very brave, fighting, macho men were suddenly behaving exactly the same way as we were.
Canberra's task was to land her troops at San Carlos. But to begin with, there was no thought that she would have to go right in.
Initially, there had been ideas that this would be done for long distance by helicopter lifts, but it very soon became apparent that the number of people and the number of helicopters available, it would have taken so long that it was impossible. The ship would have to go in to land, in fact, the troops that it had.
And I think it was about Ascension Island when it was finally confirmed that in fact we would be needed to go into the assault area.
I believe that if we'd have stayed outside, we might have gone on the first attack with Ardent, which was the first ship to go down as Ardent was outside. By going inside, at least we had protection from the ships around us, and eventually, of course, the military took their missiles ashore and, if you like, ring the whole area with defence.
As to being in St. Carlos, one felt considerably safer there in many ways than being out at sea, because one knew if she was sunk in St. Carlos, at least there'd be a lot sticking out above the water, whereas at sea the prospects would not have been so good.
So, on May the 21st, Canberra entered San Carlos water.
Everybody was extremely tense. Then, of course, when we actually went into San Carlos water, which was just before daybreak, we had no idea what the day would bring.
It was fairly dramatic, to say the least of it. I mean, one realised, having always been taught in military circles, that one never do an amphibious landing unless one had complete air superiority. Here we were doing an amphibious landing when we had no air superiority at all. And one was aware that the frigates, and particularly outside in the sun, were having a very rough time. And this indeed was brought home to us even more when Ardent, who actually had a higher level of people killed than any other unit in the Falklands War, was sunk whilst down south bombarding Goose Green, and we embarked all her survivors.
The dawn broke, and very shortly afterwards we saw, I think it was a Pucara aircraft, strafing one of the naval escort ships out in the Sound. And we thought, this is for real. You know, up till then we perhaps thought nothing would ever happen. But this was actual shots being fired in anger, not at us at the time. This Pucara then turned towards us, and we thought, no, he's going to start firing at us. He didn't, in fact. He turned away over the land, I think to tell his bosses back in Stanley probably that we'd arrived.
Jeremy Hands, who was now ashore, had a grandstand view of the Sound.
And then the following morning, which was incredibly frightening, staggeringly frightening, cold, miserable, wet. We didn't know what was going on. We didn't know where we were going. We thought we were surrounded by Argentinians. And then suddenly, over the hill, quite literally, came Canberra. And it was the most amazing thing I've ever seen in my life. I started laughing because it just seemed so incongruous that there she was, in a war zone. We were being attacked. We were surrounded by a very ferocious enemy who would quite happily have killed us. And then in came our old friend, the cruise liner, and just parked opposite.
Canberra was a primary target.
Yes, and we know now that the Argentinians certainly made one deliberate attack on, or that they hoped was going to hit, actually Canberra. 2 Argentine aircraft, Skyhawks, were sent in to attack. And they attacked over the hills. They wouldn't have seen what they were attacking until the last minute, and dropped their bombs. And actually Antelope was in our berth and we'd gone. And they hit Antelope, and the first of those 2 aircraft hit Antelope's mast, and was therefore, in fact, a wreck and unable to make any reports. And the other one, who probably made a report that the attack had gone in and been a hit, was shot down almost immediately afterwards by a Sea Harrier. And that was followed immediately by the Argentinians announcing on the wireless that Canberra had been hit and damaged. And this again was actually confirmed that they viewed they had done it. Because when we went to Argentina at the end, in order to land the prisoners, the Argentinian generals who came on board kept looking round the ship, giving him coffee, saying, "Where is all the damage? Where is all the damage?"
I mean, every day we were in San Carlos, we used to look across, and there she'd be. And we thought, God, thank God she hasn't been hit. And of course she never was, nothing ever hit her. But we see the aircraft flying through San Carlos water, the Argentinians, dropping bombs, the anti-aircraft fire, the missiles going off in all directions. We thought, God, she can't survive this. And she did, and she sat there. And it was like a lucky token in some respects. I mean, we'd obviously all fallen in love with the ship on the way down, because you do after that length of time. And there she was. We said, please, God, don't let her get hurt. You know, it's like the family.
We were terribly exposed, very little armament on board, but they didn't go for us. They went either side, and we witnessed lots of runs by Skyhawks and bombs being dropped, but we were fortunate.
Canberra was withdrawn to safer waters, but she was still important to Jeremy Hands.
We certainly used the Marisat system. We used to have to queue up for this, a little queue outside the radio shack, to make our reports back as and when we could. And whenever we could get transport, whether it be a helicopter or more often than not standing on a beach waiting for a friendly launch to go past and say, can you take us to Canberra, please? We've got stories to go back for, for the BBC and for ITN. But she was always there, and always a friendly welcome, and more important than that, a bath or a shower.
And then it was over. Canberra had been on active duty for 13 weeks and had completed a 3-month world cruise before that. Her reliability had been exceptional. Now the merchant ship the Argentinians would most like to have sunk was coming home.
It was a day that one will never forget. It almost brings tears to my eyes now. I suppose when we were down there, when we were down there, we dreamt of such a day, but didn't dare think that it might ever happen.
We didn't know what was waiting us. We had no idea. It was foggy, it was cold, it was clammy, and there were people sort of leaning over the rail and we couldn't see much. Then like a curtain, the fog lifted as we came back and we could see Southampton. And perhaps more amazingly was the flotilla around us of little ships and large cruisers and yachts and dinghies, and even a party of Boy Scouts went past in canoes. I can remember this. And then you could see what was a blur to start off with. You could see it was a sea of faces. And there was the welcome, and the banners, and the cheering and the shouting.
Britain watched on television. It was one of those infrequent occasions when a lump was brought to the national throat.
I can honestly say I've seen my company grow up. They've had their baptism of fire, and we took out boys, we brought back men.
All the way back. We had to contain something like 2,000 odd teenagers who had just won a war They were marvellously well behaved, I must add. And one of the things worth mentioning, I think, was a great testimony to the discipline that of all the troops we carried on board was really never a case of any vandalism.
People who I had a tremendous amount of time for, really brave, tough men, just in tears, totally in tears, falling about, hugging each other. We're home, we've made it, we're back.
The reception was almost beyond belief. The number of people that turned out to watch us come in.
It was Canberra's finest hour. She came back, she looked scruffy, she was a mess, and I don't think ever, I can't think of an occasion in the history of this country where one particular ship has held the affection of the British nation as much as she did that morning. It was just unbelievable to see.
We were very, very lucky to get her back in one piece.
The war over, Canberra and her captain could go back to their day jobs.
All right, let go for it.
Forecastle bridge, let go.
Very quickly got back into the old routine of looking after our passengers, who usually are a bit more demanding than the soldiers, although they could be quite demanding too, in a different way. And I think she very rapidly held a very special place in the hearts of those not only who cruised in her, but the British public at large.
Canberra, which had previously been a favourite, was now a heroine. Everybody who sailed in her had their own personal reminiscence. Among them, the chairman of P&O, Lord Stirling.
It's the first ship I think I probably on which I stepped aboard, and it was the first ship that my family and I, and we had a very young daughter, was only about 2 at that stage, ever travelled on. But there is something I do remember about the ship, which says a lot about the ship. I remember speaking to somebody and at a bar, and he was saying this is about the 25th time he's travelled on Canberra. And I bumped into him again later on the cruise, and we got to know each other a bit then. We were having another drink together up in the old crow's nest, and I said, as a matter of interest, where are you going next year on holiday? Oh, he said, Canberra, of course. I said, where are you going? He said, I've no idea. I'll ask the wife. And that for me said it all. It was the ship, which is what they were in love with, and where they were going was almost incidental.
Canberra's present captain, the current custodian of the legend, is Rory Smith.
Secure anchors forward.
Why does he, and others who know her, think Canberra has attracted such a following?
She is probably one of the last of a kind. She was built at a time when cruising was very much in its infancy, if was considered an industry at all. And she has a great feeling of warmth about her, which over the years has developed into almost a patina that surrounds the whole ship. And it is something that passengers comment on time after time, is the friendliness, the warmth, and the intimacy that Canberra has.
I like Canberra because it's all English. When I want to go off for the day, I only have to go down to the purser's office and they'll give me their money and change my money. It's all so easy and so simple.
One of her great strengths is that Canberra is not a ship for the exclusive clubs. It is a ship of the people of Britain.
She's more of a family ship. If you've been on a bigger ship, then you know what I mean. There's a lot of... directly you go out of your cabin, you meet people and you chat. And off you go to have your meals and you sit and chat. There's such a big difference. We noticed it especially. We went on the QE2 10 years ago, first of all, and it was such a difference. It's too massive. So let's get back on the Canberra. Much better.
There are certain nights aboard ship that you couldn't re-establish ashore. There are certain moments in my mind now. For instance, Island Night, which is usually in the Caribbean or somewhere, and you've got the Stadium Theatre Company and all the in-house entertainers and the old lags like myself, out on deck, balmy breeze, warm, maybe mid 75s, 80s, something like that, and it's as if you've just opened the doors of your house and you're entertaining all the neighbours around the swimming pool. The band are playing 1940s music. The people are singing. You've got all the backing singers, the dancers. It's stunning. It really is stunning. The classic story, of course, has got to be when Oriana, a beautiful ship, went on her maiden voyage, and I was on it. And I always do about a half an hour show of just my normal act, gags and routines. And then my second half hour, I usually base it on what the people have said or done or reacted to on board the cruise. And the biggest line that everybody said aboard Oriana on her maiden voyage was, "It wasn't like this on the Canberra, you know." On Canberra, there are rooms you can go to when you feel in different moods. I have different bars and corners and libraries and what have you. If I want to write some of my book, or I want to sit down and just think, or if I want to go and have a good time and there's a piano playing, and it's like the world under one roof, if you like. And I'm not sure that modern ships are going to get that kind of thing. They're beautiful, they're floating palaces, I know, but I'm not sure they're going to give you those little places of comfort, like having your own hometown where there's a local pub to drink in, the local restaurant, you can go and sit quietly and talk there, the boys in the bar. I'm not sure that you're going to be able to build that anymore.
All pre-departure checks have now been satisfactorily completed, and Canberra is about to sail for Palma.
If Canberra had developed a personality in her passengers' minds, she was every bit as much of a character to her captains. Commodore Ian Gibb has known her for 17 years. What'd she like to drive?
Idiosyncratic, I think. You always had to be on your mettle, because she never did the same thing, one after the other. Coming into Southampton each time was an experience. She handled idiosyncratically, I think. That's the only way I can say about it. You had to watch her. She was like a wayward lady sometimes. She was heavy, and she had some very, very powerful engines, which fortunately were turbo-electric. That got us out of many difficult situations, but she only had a single rudder, and that was the thing that you had to watch. Certainly making the very tight turns at the entrance to Southampton. The two tight turns off Calshot and the Brambles were quite difficult.
Heavy. She is a very heavy ship for her size, which is one of the characteristics of why she is so good in very heavy weather. But as far as the driving of the ship in maneuvering circumstances, so long as you take her slowly, she reacts in the main as you would expect, and she is very forgiving.
She was always extremely good as a sea ship. I think probably one of the best sea ships I've been with. She had the length and the sleekness to cut through most of the waves that we experienced. She was built for traversing the world in any sort of weather.
In September 1993, she was hit by a famous storm. Rory Smith was her captain.
Well, the wind strengths got up to, they were about force 12, and it becomes a bit difficult to gauge it after that. She performed beautifully. The seas were high, and obviously the wind likewise was very strong. And it was deemed for the comfort of the passengers that we should heave to, as we say. So we reduced speed to the most comfortable speed that we could, and it was quite an experience to look out at Canberra, this lovely old ship, ploughing through this very heavy sea at 12 knots, whereas other ships, much more modern, newer, which had also been forced to heave to, they were going backwards.
In later life, her speed was geared down to about 23 knots, partly to contain her 250 tons of oil a day fuel consumption. But she could still turn on the power when needed. Ian Gibb.
I recall very clearly one occasion where a lady was in hospital, very seriously ill, and the doctor wanted to get to a port as quickly as we could, where she could be looked after in the most professional way. And we spoke to the chief engineer, and he managed to find somehow, and we don't know where, an extra knot and a half, and we were speeding along at 25 knots up the Adriatic. The woman assistant purser in fluent Italian was able to speak to the heart surgeon, who was waiting at 2 and 3 in the morning. We landed her into the Carabinieri craft, and she was whizzed over to the hospital, and he was operating by 4, and she survived the experience. And I don't think many ships could have pulled that out. And she was a 30-year-old ship at that time, and to pull that little bit extra out of her, marvellous. If you think of asking your grandmother to run the 100 yards, you can equate that.
Canberra, of course, has her own hospital, including a small operating theatre. Of all the dramas it has witnessed, none was happier than the occasion in 1981, supervised by Sister Alison Ross. Andrew Terry was born on the ship. He and his family have cruised on Canberra every year since.
Glad. You're getting very tall now, aren't you? Yes.
The ship was in the news again in 1987, when it rescued the Jones family, whose round-the-world yacht sank in heavy seas off Panama.
The Joneses' life raft had been drifting across the Pacific shipping lanes for almost 18 hours when the Canberra finally closed in for the rescue. The family had been forced to abandon ship in such a hurry that they had no radio and only 5 flares on board. The Canberra executed the rescue maneuver after being called in by a Korean ship. After a rest and some food, the family told how the Korean vessel's own attempt at the tricky rescue almost went disastrously wrong.
And all of a sudden this glorious white sight came over the horizon.
And we knew...
And I said, "Me God, I think it's one of ours," you know. And she gradually came close. I could see the bow, and then I could see the name. And I said, "Well, it could be." No, it can't be the Canberra. But he said, "It jolly well is, you know."
In 1994, Canberra found herself at the centre of national affairs once more, when she took part in the commemoration of the 50th anniversary of D-Day. It was an occasion Commodore Gibb will never forget.
It was the day of the Spithead Review, and that was quite indescribable. It was magnificent. The ships all dressed overall. It was quite a blustery day. We had to manoeuvre ourselves into a very tight anchorage during the hours of darkness, and when dawn broke, it was blustery, but we were all there waiting for the Royal Yacht to be led by the Patricia, which is the Trinity House vessel around the circuit, and then the Royal Yacht having passed, and it was wonderful, a wonderful experience to see all those boats dotted about the white water. We then picked up our anchor, manoeuvred clear of the anchorage, and set off across the channel. And during that passage, we had the most magnificent of church services.
Today we have with us 1,500 veterans, their widows or families, who participated in the D-Day landings in another war.
They had found a padre who had been on the beaches, the only remaining padre, and he and I took this service with all the old veterans, men and women, a more magnificent group of people I don't think I've ever come across. Tears were brought to the eyes, and then when the Lancaster bomber came over and dropped the poppies, I don't think there was a dry eye in the house. A wonderful experience.
Canberra has been of enormous importance to P&O. Lord Stirling.
It's been a true flagship. I mean, it's a term which is often used quite loosely, but I think where that ship is concerned, I mean, that's what it really stands for. And probably it was the first ship which in the public mind represented cruising in the modern age. When one talks about the feeling in the public's mind, we talk about the ship, but a ship is only alive with its crew. And I think possibly the relationship between the actual ship itself and the atmosphere created by the crew is what people really think about Canberra. So you can't separate it from the crew and the friendliness and the atmosphere on board that ship. It's one and the same. You can't really separate the fabric from the human factor.
No story of Canberra would be complete without mention of her Asian crew. Traditionally, the cabin and restaurant stewards come from Goa, the engine room staff and deck crew from Pakistan. Several have served many years with P&O, often continuing long family traditions. They'll miss the ship as much as anyone. But why is she being withdrawn? Lord Stirling again.
That has to be, I'm afraid. You get to a stage where the facilities on board a ship longer term and what in practice you would have to spend on that ship, taking her age, really is not practical. And more important, I think that the facilities, which in a strange way people are prepared to accept. I mean, the back end of the ship is not quite the same as the front end, if we put it that way around. And I think the modern facilities that people actually want is something you couldn't possibly provide in the longer term. So sadly, it's rather like a good party. You mustn't let it go on to a point where people start to be dissatisfied. And we feel that it was greeted with a sense of sadness, but not total surprise.
And so Canberra approaches her final cruise. Alice Lovely had booked 3 previous years, thinking each would be her last. This time, when her travel agent called, she checked.
She said, "What about the Canberra, Mrs. Lovely?" Oh, I said, "I've done 3 years thinking it's the last voyage." So I said, "I'll leave it until it is." She said, "It is the last voyage." I said, "Is it really?" She said, "Yes. It's the farewell trip." I said, "Oh, well, book me in." I'm nearly at the end of my life, and I'm so pleased I'm going to be going on the last voyage to say goodbye to her.
Captain Bradford has planned his own farewell.
I'm hoping to pick up an aircraft from my flying club from Chobden, which is in Herefordshire, and fly down to Southampton in water and sort of waggle my wings and wave to the ship as she comes in last time. That's what I would like to say. I don't think I'd like to be there in person. It'd be rather sad.
Rory Smith will be in command on the final voyage.
As far as the ship's company are concerned, we are going to treat it not as a time of reminiscing, but of a time of celebration of all the things that the ship has been through in 36 years. We intend to really remember the good things, the marvellous times, and the experiences that she's had over 36 years. And the emotional time will come when she comes up Southampton water for the last time. That is when the emotions will be jerked. Suddenly this institution, this home, will go. And it will be a very difficult time for many of us.
They knew she was special when Canberra was launched. Her layout and her looks ensured that. No one, though, could have guessed what she would become. She was the liner that closed one chapter in British marine history and the cruise ship which opened another. She was a national emblem. Above all, in 36 years, she has cherished close on 1 million passengers. But let the final words belong to those who knew her best.
For me, the Falklands was Canberra. She was home. She was base. She was sanity in an insane episode of history.
A very beautiful ship, a very special ship. Will always hold a special place in my heart.
A great ship and a great lady.
She's there, she's the grand old lady. She's the Queen Mother of the Seas, really.
A wonderful ship, one that will probably never be replaced in people's minds.
You can't beat her, I don't think.
She's a marvellous ship. They'll never see the likes of her again. And I certainly am very, very pleased and proud that I was able to sail in her.
One of the great British institutions.